Welcome back to Eliminating the Pitfalls, Steps to Virtualization in Government, sponsored by Nutanix on Federal News Radio. My guests today, Dave Gwynn of Nutanix, Chuck Riddle of the Government Printing Office, Gary Bartlett of the Postal Service Inspector General's Office, and Greg Garcia of the Army. Gentlemen, implementation of virtualization is a critical phase, as is business case, as we've spoken already. Greg, we've already talked about some of the issues that you ran across with the number of hops. Tell me more about that process, and not just the discovery, because the discovery seems to be pretty self-descriptive, but how you eliminated some of those hops and the issues that you were able to resolve because of that.
I think one of the sort of the important things is your partners and who you pick, and the understanding that actually every environment is different. There are many that believe once you do VDI infrastructure successfully that you can export that very easily among other partners, and that's kind of the I think one of the first things we learned is, someone came in with a lot of success of implementing VDI, and then in our specific environment it just didn't work. Again, based on prioritization of the traffic, quality of service. It's not only the quality of service of getting data to the desktop, but the desktop back to the server, as we mentioned about the mouse clicks and the responsiveness. And then there's this whole thing about going outside of your enclave into what we would do in the Pentagon is go through our partners in DISA to the general internet and back. And there's lots of positives and negatives about security and throughput and latency and the cost equation there. That you have to take that whole user experience, as we talked earlier, Chuck and Gary hit, is that the user is the determinant of success. It's not necessarily security, or they're going to make their opinion, but the user determines if it is satisfactory to meet their mission needs. And that's the ultimate judge of viability. And that's the responsive desktop that is present and persistent where they come and they can go. And that's really one of the things you have to balance. And unfortunately for me, I serve as the designated approval authority, the DAA, for our network stuff. So I have to balance I have the personal responsibility of security, and I let them have an opinion about the importance of security. But at the end of the day, there are certain mandates that we have to follow, and that we talked about. That balance is important.
The user determines success, Gary. That seems to be a theme that I hear all throughout government. It's appropriate. We want the people who are going to fulfill the mission of the agency to have their stuff work. At what stage did you introduce that into your implementation strategy? At what point did you work with the end users to determine how successful they were going to be with what you did?
So we actually built it into our requirements before we even started. Mm-hmm. In fact, we led a contract. We brought a vendor in who's actually in the process of doing our VDI implementation. Part of that contract that we let is, number one, doing a measuring of our users as they live today. So right now we are monitoring the network. They brought in tools to do that. They're monitoring the network. They understand the user experience, and they understand that the user experience can be no worse than what it is today. Obviously, the goal is to make it much better than what it is today. Mm-hmm. But that's part of their success criteria for the vendor. So we've talked to the users about what they're experiencing today. The users are being interviewed, but we've got software tools that are doing that monitoring. And then as we start the rollout, there'll be a pilot step phase through this, and we'll be again interviewing those users, taking their understanding what they perceive, and then also from a monitoring perspective what the network's showing us, mm-hmm. and then combining those two to give the user the experience that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. The user experience at GPO, Chuck, you talked when you were talking about the business case, that you don't have just a standard fleet of a bunch of people sitting at terminals. You have blue-collar workers that are using information in any number of different ways. Mobility was something that you mentioned as important. Tell me about the end-user experience and how you gauge it, how you measure it the way that Gary described.
Sure. Well, you only get one shot at a first impression. Mm-hmm. And you really, with application virtualization especially, you've got to be very incremental and careful about how you roll that out. So we really focus a lot on pilot groups, as I'm sure everybody has mentioned, so that you really get that feedback directly from your customers before you really start to roll things out wholesale. Working with our folks, we look at the network traffic, make sure that we're delivering. I think what Gary said about we've got to make sure that what we're delivering is at least as good as what they have now, because if it's not, they're not going to buy into it at all. So it's really an incremental process, and you've got to be very cautious and methodical with how you roll it out, because you once you've lost that interest and people don't think it works, it's tough to get that back.
Dave, this is where this turns into a cultural issue too. This is a change management thing, and the technology is certainly important, but it's not the only important issue. This is a person-to-person interface when someone comes and shows you how something's going to work, or you take training to understand how something's going to work. Tell me about some of the things that agencies run into that they wouldn't necessarily have to run into with a little bit of a different change management approach.
Well, you're spot on. Change management is what it's all about in this environment, and what that means. People bring to the table preconceived notions, and a lot of times there are those who are a little more resistant to change. There are those who are early adopters that maybe are more inclined to change. So you never know what you're going to get, and the broader the audience, the greater a blend of all of those things you're going to get. Some of our customers have done very well with doing before and after surveys, and in particular, the before surveys are best done if they're not really done, saying, hey, we're thinking about changing, and how do you like things now? Because then your pragmatists are going to be a little more inclined to say, no, I love things now, and they're going to cling to it. So if you ask questions that are more vague in the before case, where you say, hey, how are things going today? Do you like your desktop? Do you like how these applications run? And they see that as a chance maybe to complain. Then you're going to get real data. And that way, when you do your modernization effort and you're virtualizing, you come out with whatever this new thing is, the second survey can be compared to the first, rather than just sort of having the second survey with no data to compare it to. So pilots, surveys, those are all big things. And you also touch on, the end users are key. But the IT guys themselves are also key. And when we're talking about some of these virtualization efforts, you're going to have a server guy, a storage guy, a network guy, a desktop guy, a security guy. I mean, just those are five guys, right? For your initiative to succeed, those guys all have to get along well and all view this as being in their best interest. And so you also have to manage the IT staff if you have that many moving parts to this thing.
This is a standard team building exercise, a standard management type exercise for somebody who's leading all this. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, and I think part of what you need to do, and part of the whole goal of hyperconvergence, and the reason people see it as an advantage, is that if you can eliminate some of those tiers, if you can say, look, we don't need all of those tiers to be in place, then you've eliminated some of the variables in the equation. So you're either going to have to get all the variables singing on the same sheet of music, or you can eliminate the variables, which kind of goes back to that first phase. This phase of implementation is where your decisions that you made in the pre-implementation phase come home to roost, right? So you have to look at that in advance and say, hey, would it be better if we use this type of infrastructure versus that, in order to make it simpler so that we have fewer variables in the equation?
Now, you talked about something a moment ago, Dave, that I want to come back to, and I want to ask all of you gentlemen to give me your input on this. But I'm struck by that curve or continuum that you alluded to, where you have some people who are early adopters, you have some people who are resistors, and then there are people at various points in between. I've heard that on a number of occasions for all different kinds of applications, not just virtualization. Do you find that curve is pretty consistent project to project and agency to agency, or is it something that whoever's leading that will have to try to anticipate and then pivot on when he or she sees how people are responding to whatever it is that they're implementing?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I do think it's consistent that you will always see probably a similar percentage of each within your organization, and as with the law of large numbers, the larger the number, the more likely you'll be right in those same numbers. But there are certain initiatives that are a little more polarizing than others. So certainly, when you're VDI is a good one. We've had cases where end users were deathly afraid of VDI and said, no, I don't want VDI, and then ultimately the IT staff said, okay, you don't have it. But in truth, they did. Next thing you know, they're happy as clams, but they're told after the fact, hey, by the way, you've been running this for a month. So people just, there are going to be those that have a preconceived resistance to something like this. But in the long run, it is something you just have to manage from the get-go.
Chuck, do you find that change management issue is consistent project to project and that you found similar results in your virtualization efforts that you found other places?
I'd say so. Change is always hard, and the technology folks are normally the easiest ones to get to change because they see the benefits that most people don't necessarily see. They would know it if they're running virtual desktop versus most users may not. So we try to strive to test those folks out first, eat our own dog food, if you will, before we even try to roll it out to anyone else. And I do find that there's just some people that are so adverse to change. They just don't want to change how they do anything, and they're scared to death of VDI because they're not in control of anything. They can't change a screensaver anymore. So those are the folks that you really have to realize there's a percentage of those out there, and you just have to get as much positive buzz going with the people that love it to help counteract some of the negative that you get from those folks that are very resistant to want to change.
One technique that's along the lines of what Chuck is talking about, Gary, is the idea of selling the benefit rather than the technique. And I wonder how much of that was a part of what you did at the IG's office, the Postal Service.
Oh, it's been huge. In fact, I've spent probably the last 6 months as we were prepping for this, even before we did any kind of award, as we were just getting into the planning stages of this, going out and basically evangelizing this to the community. Various settings, small groups, large groups, based on different functions that were going on, and standing in front of them, not talking about the technology at all, talking about, hey, imagine this, you're working on a spreadsheet. You leave your laptop at work. You go home. Your boss calls you and needs you to make an update immediately. Wouldn't it be nice if, and really laying out the benefits to where, hey, imagine you lose your laptop. Wouldn't it be nice if you don't have to worry about getting in trouble because you had, a case file on that laptop? So really putting it in terms of the way that they do business today, and using that as kind of now I've got a lot of my users going, hey, where are we? When are we going to get this, Gary? You've been talking about this for about 6 months. When am I going to get my hands on it? So really trying to gin up some of that excitement and getting them to ask me for it as opposed to something I'm imposing on them.
Yeah. Greg, this is setting expectations then, it sounds like, and preparing people for what they'll get rather than for what you're going to do, which are the same thing. It's just describing it a different way, it sounds like.
I use a term called bell cows. You don't have to convince I grew up in Texas, and you don't have to convince all the cows to come in. You just got to convince the bell cow to come in, and they'll bring all the rest of the cows. That's really the strategy that we try to employ, is find the bell cow for the service that we're trying to virtualize and get them to be your advocate. My experience is if you're the advocate and you're the IT person, you're already distrusted. You have to find someone in the user group that is just as much a co-advocate or even better to posture them for success, so they'll bring all the cows to the solution. So I think that's important. We've implemented what I affectionately call expectation management documents. My experience is people, you a lot of times meet the requirements, but if you don't meet the expectations, they have a very negative connotation. So we try to address expectations in addition to requirements in a formal fashion that says, this is what these are all the requirements, this is what we're going to do, but we expect you to do this, and we expect to do that, and clarify the fringe requirements, because that's, in my experience, where people tend to lose support of the populace that you're trying to serve, is I thought you were going to do blank. So we're very clear about what we're going to do for requirements, but very clear about what we're going to do on the expectation side, both what they're supposed to do and what we're supposed to do. In my experience, a lot of times they say, oh, I expected you to do A through Z. We're not going to do anything. It's like, well, that doesn't work that way. So you got to be very clear about the partnership and the partnership responsibilities and goals.
Dave, we're back to another classic technique, which is just communication, similar to what we talked earlier about management, a classic management technique. This is another one, just very clear communications and setting expectations.
Absolutely. And by the way, I'm going to take that bell cow term. I like that. One other thought on this is that you're going to, these same users that you're hoping will adopt and embrace this, and you're going to do everything you can in order to get them to, you have to face the reality that there will be challenges. Otherwise, we wouldn't have help desks, right? But you need to make sure that your help desk is able to solve problems as quickly as possible, because the other thing that can kill you is if there is, one or two people that go down, and perhaps if heaven forbid it's one of your bell cows, then very quickly things can go south after the fact if you've got that person that had a challenge kind of raving about it at the water cooler. And that goes back to the complexity conversation, because in these cases, the end users don't call the help desk and say, hey, I've got a firmware mismatch on 2 of my host bus adapters. It doesn't come in like that. It comes in as a needle in a haystack. It's, hey, my desktop is slow, or hey, my database is running slow. And that means, you have the clock starts ticking on you to go find that needle in a haystack and get it resolved as quickly as possible. And there are numerous users affected. So again, elimination of complexity and not having too many moving parts is going to, in effect, shrink the size of that haystack and make it simpler for you to get to resolution as quickly as possible when there are problems.
Dave, I love Greg's concept of really formalizing in written form the expectations and the end results. Do you see that commonly, and maybe do you think people should do that a lot more often than they do?
I think it's an absolute necessity. I mean, if you can get people to document, again, the before and after thing is big. And when people get told after the fact that something in their life was changed, and it's very easy for them to go, well, no, I liked the way I had it. And you have to have something that goes back to saying, well, I've got something here that indicates you weren't such a big fan of how you had it. And so, yes, documenting the before, documenting the after, getting buy-in. I love what Gary's saying as well, of saying, there are the benefits to the IT organization. There's the savings in terms of infrastructure costs and graining your data center and telecommuting and things like that. But you have to also look at the benefits that you're going to bring to the end users and make sure that you quantify for them those things in parallel to what you're seeing as the benefits to your organization.
Dave Gwynn of Nutanix on this panel hosted by Nutanix called Eliminating the Pitfalls, Steps to Virtualization in Government. This is Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.